Welcome from across the UK and around the world, indeed, for this first online event from Agile Rabbit, which is in partnership with the University of Exeter. Now, in the world of radio, which I usually inhabit, you imagine you're having a one-to-one. There's that kind of intimacy that radio has. Well, I kind of hope that's what's going to happen tonight. Everyone knows that they're part of a wider conversation. We're on air, but there's a sort of intimacy to this, isn't there? This is the joy of the online world, if there is one. I hope that we can have a great conversation. Do use the chat to say hello, to introduce yourself, to say where you're from and why you're interested in this topic. We're keen to hear from you on all of those issues. There are lots more online events being organised. Next week, we're back at this time with Guy Standing, who will be speaking to us live from Geneva. It's a conversation about the relevance in this time of pandemic and economic crisis about universal basic income. And it is something that's being discussed a lot in economic circles. Agile Rabbit normally puts on events like this in Devon, but for the moment we're having to make do with Web World. I have to say the cream tea's not nearly as good around here. But sadly, Devon, like the entire rest of the world, is off limits for now. But the good news is most of these events are recorded as podcasts and they're available on the website. So do go and take a look. There are loads of them, lots to choose from, and some really good issues there. And Agile Rabbit essentially explores ideas, global affairs, and the natural and scientific world. And as I say, you can find podcasts on topics as diverse as why are there fewer female psychopaths? And can I do anything about climate change? Do go to the website, do take a look. There's lots to choose from. Now, this evening, let's get back to this evening. We're going to have a talk for about 20 minutes, followed by a discussion. And as I say, do use the chat to comment, share links and resources as you'd like to. We want this to be very participatory. And you can also use the Q&A function to ask questions. Kate's colleagues are also online to answer as many of those as possible as we go along. David Simons, Isabel Fletcher, Ella Band and Lauren Enright are all waiting to hear from you, and they'll be answering them in real time. After Kate's given her talk, she'll be answering some of the questions that have been submitted in advance. I'll be asking her those. And also, if you have any technical issues, try exiting the Zoom meeting and re-entering, the old switch it on and switch it off. Always sophisticated, always works. Or you can private message Agile Rabbit. And the email message thing is private message them, sorry, on Zoom. Or if you have any more problems, you can do contact@agile-rabbit.com and they'll try and help you if they can. This event is being recorded. We'll upload the recording to the website and email you all with a link. But now, without further ado, shall we get on with this evening's event? Now, it has to be said, when we got in touch with this evening's contributor, she said she thought isolation was meant to be quieter, but actually it's been busier than ever. There's no baking banana bread going on at Kate's house. That's because with a specialism in bats and diseases, in the last few weeks, Kate has been everywhere, from the Washington Post to the Today programme. We'll be looking in some depth at how taking bats out of their natural habitats led to the coronavirus moving to humans. About 75% of all diseases are zoonotic, so there's nothing unusual about infectious diseases and that move from animals to humans. But with SARS, MERS, Ebola and coronavirus all being traced to bats, we'll be asking, what is it about bats and the way we interact with these very wild animals that demands further investigation? And to lead us very ably through all of this, please welcome Professor Kate Jones from UCL. Kate, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's a fantastic opportunity to talk to everybody this evening. So as I've been introduced, I'm a Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity, Kate Jones from University College London. And I've been absolutely fascinated by bats for over 30 years, I'd say. So I studied their ecology, their evolution, and their conservation. I was a past chair of the Bat Conservation Trust in the UK, and I work across the world on bats. So I'm going to try and talk to you this evening about how bats have changed the world, but not only change the world, but change my world too, and how bats have changed our view of nature, but also of our understanding of how human health is intimately linked and connected to the health of our planet. So I'm just going to share my talk. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then have chance to talk to everybody in the questions. Oh no, that's wrong. Hold on. Okay, good. That wasn't quite as smooth as I anticipated, but right. So I'm going to talk to you about how bats have changed the world. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about how bats changed my world first. And I became absolutely fascinated by bats when I was an undergraduate at university, and bats, you know, changed my attitude towards wildlife, and I became fascinated with them because they're just amazing. But they personally changed my world in a big way when I went on an expedition to Puerto Rico in 1999. And we went on an expedition to look at the effects of the massive Hurricane George on Puerto Rico. And it was in the direct path of this hurricane. And we wanted to see what effect it had had on the biodiversity, and especially the bats. So this is one of my stupid cartoons, but just to show you, we were outside Boa Cave, and it was inhabited by boa constrictors coming down off the top of the cave. And we were catching bats and just looking at them and then letting them go. So the reason why it was an awesome trip, but the reason why it changed my life was because I got a zoonotic disease. I got a bat bug from that. So I only literally caught an exciting bug as in fascination of bats, but I literally caught a bat bug. So this is what happened to my lungs. So I picked up a pathogen, a fungal pathogen called Histoplasma capsulatum, and it causes either you to be fine or you to die. So unfortunately, I lived, and I had huge scarring on my lungs. So I picked it. It's a fungal pathogen that lives in bat caves. This was one of the largest ones in Puerto Rico. There's about 4 million bats in that cave. And we were wading through lots of bat poo. So I didn't have a mask on, and I caught this disease. So this pathogen I picked up caused my lungs to look like at the bottom here. So these are all tiny nodules of calcified scars on my lungs. So it changed my world. Bats definitely did change my world, but also they've changed yours to become unrecognizable. And that's why, the reason is because you know, we haven't got any direct evidence yet, and that's really important to emphasize. But we have a suspicion, and the evidence suggests that the coronavirus, which is causing COVID-19, is very, very similar, 96% similar to one that's found in Chinese horseshoe bats, Rhinolophus affinis. So this is a very cute bat. It's got a lovely nose leaf on its nose to direct its echolocation calls that it uses to find insects in the dark. So this virus has changed our world, and it's meant that I have to stay in now because of my lungs. But what I think what I need to say is, like, you know, it's easy to as we take stock of what's happened and the massive seismic shift in our world and our lives. Bats are a really easy target, right? This one looks a bit evil. They get in your hair, they're dirty, mysterious, they suck blood. They're really easy to blame for our predicament that we're in at the moment, and my lungs, right? Wrong! Bats are really amazing. They're uniquely adaptive animals, and I'm going to show you that the underlying causes of disease spillover from wildlife is really rooted in our destruction of different habitats and over-exploitation of wild species and of places. So hopefully you'll come with me on this short little journey that we're going to make. Okay, so we're really disrupting natural ecosystems. We've had a massive growth in human populations. We've fragmented lots and lots of landscapes, so the road density of our planet has rapidly increased. And so that means that we have very few patches of big untouched landscapes and habitats. So that means that there's less areas for wildlife to be in, and there's more contacts between humans and wildlife. And also we light up the night as well, and other pollutants too. And these are really important because that disrupts the natural cycle, and species that are present on the planet now have to adapt to really big changing conditions. So we've destroyed a lot of habitat, and that's a really big and major threat to ecosystems and the animals which are present. So the biggest kind of driver of extinction and of population declines of different species of animals and of vertebrates, of reptiles, amphibians, mammals and fish and birds is habitat degradation. So it's actually just chopping down forests, but also with exploitation. So that's direct hunting. And you've seen talk about wild animal markets, and I'll talk a bit about that a bit later. But also invasive species and disease causes a lot of destruction of our species, and pollution, and of course climate change is an increasing threat. So we're disrupting natural systems, and that, as I said, was causing declines of different populations. And this is just showing you what the kind of the threat level is for different groups of animals and plants. So amphibians are really really badly hit, and mammals are too, birds less so. So there is a kind of a difference in how and what species are, how threatened species are. But overall, there's a big trend in declines of species across the planet, and that's causing these ecosystems to be disrupted. Okay, so does that actually matter? So does it matter that we're disrupting ecosystems? Because we live longer and more prosperous lives than ever before. Well, we did before a couple of months ago, but we live longer and prosperous lives than we ever have before. And we've created conditions for better health for billions and billions of people. So does it really matter that we're disrupting these ecosystems? Well, there's huge amounts of evidence that it does really matter that we're disrupting these ecosystems. And I've put up this diagram, which looks a bit complex, but it's kind of an example of the way that a lot of people have been conceptually thinking about this in terms of what is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem. What has it ever done for us? So the green box here is just all of life on Earth, and it has some kind of ecosystem service. So this is a very human-centered view of the planet. So it's all about us. So some services are being provided, and then they produce some goods for us. And I've got some examples of those services and goods in this diagram here. So that's just kind of showing you the things that we can get from wild places and wild things. So raw materials, air quality regulation, climate regulation, water regulation, all of those things, they're called ecosystem services and ecosystem goods. Now the kicker is that contributes to our human health and well-being in terms of economy, health, and shared societal and cultural values, the things that we value culturally. But then if you change those interactions, you change the ecosystem services that are being produced, and then you change the goods which are being provided to us. And that's really important if you want a sustainable planet. You've got to make sure that you're looking after your ecosystems. And it's not just me saying this. This is part of DEFRA's 25-year plan. It's the new Environment Bill for the UK. This is also part of the London Environment Strategy. And there was even an economics company that looked at the economic value of green spaces in London. It was billions of pounds that they're worth in terms of our health and mental well-being. And then also there's a new, or fairly new, intergovernmental panel on ecosystem services and biodiversity called IPBES. So it's like the IPCC. So it's also thinking about these things really seriously. And as an international community, we've embedded all these ideas into the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can see, like 14 and 15 are things about saving ecosystems, because they're linked to all of these other things that are really important to us. So reason I'm saying this is because disease and pest regulation is one of the ecosystem services, and I've highlighted it here in the blue circle. So that's really weird. So intact ecosystems protect us from diseases. How does that work? So I'm going to kind of talk you through that. So zoonotic diseases are diseases which come from animals. So we call them zoonoses. So these can have it directly from animals, or in other interpretations it could be from a vector like a mosquito as well. So there's a bit of a woolly terms around zoonotic disease, but it could be from, it usually has an animal source, either directly or indirectly. And these events cause a huge amount of disruption in human populations. So about 2/3 to 3/4 of all human infectious diseases are from animals. So talking about HIV, AIDS, SARS, MERS, and COVID-19 is also one of those things, and the thing that's in my lungs. So Ebola was also one of those things that happened in 2014, 2015, and this caused a huge economic impact in some of the most vulnerable areas of the world, and caused a huge number of people to die, and caused a huge amount of economic pain too. So these events, when they happen, are very serious. So zoonotic diseases can cause large impacts. But how are they transmitted? Well, if they're from animals, 2/3 of them are from, 2/3 to 3/4 are from of human infectious diseases, zoonotic, and they can be transferred from through the air, through vectors, being closely associated with animals, and also through consumption of food, depending on what type of pathogen it is. So that you can also be infected directly from animals, from bites and things like that. So zoonotic diseases are transmitted in a variety of different ways to human populations, and there's evidence to suggest that the rate of zoonotic diseases in human populations is increasing over the last few decades. But we need to do more work on that, and they're very hard to measure. So what causes these things to happen? So you have to think about the kind of pathways of transmission that I just showed you, and those are being disrupted when we disrupt ecosystems. So if you have like emerging infectious diseases, that's in the wildlife thing in the yellow circle here, and then you've got the overlap with human ones, and then domestic animal ones, and you've got some kind of overlap between those things. And if you're changing the drivers of transmission pathways by human activities, then you're going to get a change in the transmission dynamics between animals and people. So just to say that all species have their own pathogens and they can survive them quite happily. So we have common cold and other diseases in us, and we're full of pathogens, and we've co-evolved with them over millions and millions of years. And that's the same for all animals. But it's this transmission dynamics between things that we've not been exposed to and now are new and into us, which is the problem. So there's lots of work going on about understanding these drivers and how they change the transmission pathways between wildlife, humans, and domestic species, and of course vectors as well, but they're not in this diagram. So things like global travel and urbanization would cause more humans to be on the planet and to be moving about more. So once you get a zoonotic disease, it's more likely to travel across the world because there's more of us. If you're encroaching into human population, into wildlife population, so humans going into land that they've never been in before. You can get novel diseases transferring across. You can also have agricultural intensification and have a wildlife and a domestic spillover of a disease. So you could expose the domestic species to a wildlife pathogen, and then that has an amplification effect in the domestic species and spills over into us. So there's lots of interfaces where this can happen. And what we're doing is changing these ecosystems and these transmission dynamics. I showed you before about how we're disrupting natural ecosystems, and we're disrupting these transmission pathways between wildlife, animal, and human populations. Okay, so there's been a massive debate about the role of natural areas in trying to minimize disease. So I showed you that slide about ecosystem services. So can we say that if you have a wild intact area, that means that you won't get spillovers between disease with animals and people? Well, I published a paper a long time ago now, and I showed like areas which were high in biodiversity, so high in the number of mammal species, and areas which had a lot of people and a lot of human growth were really hotspots for emerging infectious diseases. So I showed a kind of amplification effect of biodiversity. So that's not a good news story. That's like where there's more biodiversity and more viruses, you get more spillovers. So we've been trying to understand what these relationships are between biodiversity and the amount of the chance of getting an infectious disease. And so I think our thinking has moved on over the last 10 years or so since that paper came out. And we've been thinking about biodiversity in a much more complicated and nuanced way. So there's the idea that if you have a degraded system, you have less species in there, so you have less biodiversity, but you also change the biodiversity that's there. So it's not just fewer species, it's a species of a particular kind. And I'm illustrating this with this slide from Lyme's disease. So Lyme's disease originated in the US and is in different parts of the world now. And when you have an intact system, it's intact forest, for example, the Lyme disease is transmitted by a tick, and there are lots and lots of different species in an intact system. And this possum, the possum, is really good at grooming the ticks off. So that in an intact system, there are these white-footed mice and the opossums, but as a community, the kind of viral load of the pathogen is lower. And so you have less transmission within the community, and then you have less chance of it getting into a human. But when you have a degraded system, you get systems where you have loads of more mice and rodents, and the opossums can't deal with like a housing estate and a tiny patch of forest. So you have this degraded system, and white-footed mice are rubbish at dealing with these ticks. And so you have a lot more viral load across the community. So it's not just about biodiversity per se, this is not the amount of biodiversity, but it's how we're changing these ecological systems to be quite unbalanced. So if I just showed you, I'll show you this example where you've got kind of urban gradient. So on the side here, you've got like abundance of the number of animals, or the number of, the occupancy of different areas, or some kind of measure of the number of individuals there are. So in kind of more urbanizing areas where you get more urban across the bottom, you get a change in the species that are present. So, in urban areas, you might see loads of foxes, loads of pigeons, you get these they're really common species, but you've got a massive filter, this species filter in the middle here. So you might get more rodents, but you have a much lower density of a lot of bigger species or more carnivores. So you get this kind of drop off in the species that are present. And I think we're just altering communities as we're increasing human pressure. And so you get these very strange urban filters or anthropogenic filters on communities, which mean that the species present are more abundant, and they also tend to be species which live fast and die young, and kind of invest less in immune responses, and it might be that they host more pathogens. So this is an area that's really cutting edge at the moment. We're trying to understand what the impact of land use is, and climate change as well, but land use on the risk of getting different diseases. Okay, so just to end on some bat stuff, because I love bats. There's been a lot of talk about whether bats are special. Are they special reservoirs of diseases? Is it somehow that bats are evil and dirty, and that's why they're giving us all these horrible zoonotic diseases? So this is some results from a paper that came out, I think, last week. So they did a massive survey of all the viruses that they could find that are also found in us. So these are viruses which can be transmitted to us, and we share them with lots of different species. So they looked in lots and lots of different orders of mammals and birds, and these are just the order names along the side, and that's bats there, Chiroptera. So it's just looking at the number of zoonotic viruses that bats have compared to everything else. So they don't actually have more than anything, well, more than, say, rodents, for example, and carnivores, but that's not very convincing, because the more you look for viruses, the more you find. So you have to kind of think about how much effort's gone into looking for these. But then more convincing is this one here, which is just showing you the proportion that are zoonotic compared to the amount that they have. So there are a lot of bats, so there are over 1,400 species. So you'd expect them to have a lot of pathogens, because each species has its own thing. So there's a big diversity of viruses, but they don't have more than you would expect given how many species there are. So I would say, are these special hosts of viruses? No. Okay, but I would say that bats have some amazing physiological and metabolic adaptations, which perhaps might make them really, really good at protecting themselves from viruses. So they have, but just by chance, right? So bats obviously are, they fly, and they've adapted to flight by developing these metabolic pathways which enable them to create lots and lots of energy. So they have lots and lots of mitochondria in their cells. And when you ramp up your metabolism in that way, you produce lots of free radicals. Now, this isn't a L'Oreal advert. This is like free radicals from metabolism. And they have to deal with all of these free radicals as they're flying. And they have to get them out of their cell, else they'll damage their DNA. So they've developed loads and loads of adaptations to dealing with free radicals which would damage their DNA. So it means they're really good at repairing DNA. So it means that they live longer than you would expect for their body size. So say a little species that we would find in the UK might live up to 40 years, and that's the same size as a little mouse. And a mouse would, say, live for a couple of years. So they've got these really amazing DNA repair mechanisms, and that might also make them better at dealing with pathogens which get into their cells. So they might be pre-adapted to deal with viruses. So the flip side of that is, when a virus gets into a human or another species that's just not kind of adapted to this amazing DNA repair mechanism and metabolism that a bat has, these are kind of viruses which are kind of used to being in a bat, and we don't have the kind of DNA repair mechanisms that they do. So these are just ideas at the moment. One other thing is that when they're flying, they have high temperatures, and high temperature is a really good way for humans and other species to get rid of viruses. But when we have a temperature, it's not nearly as high as a bats would be, and so that they're not. The bat virus would be like, yeah, whatever. That's not high enough to create any problems for me. So these are all ideas at the moment, but there's some really interesting adaptations that bats have in their cells, and actually they could hold the key to understanding how we deal with these horrible viruses which get into us. So are they special hosts of viruses, or maybe they have adaptations which mean that the viruses which can live in bats are not so great when they transfer to people. Okay, so just to wrap up then, I've said that you know, bat viruses might pose a particular risk, but they don't have more than you would expect from just the amount of bats there are. But I just wanted to end with the fact that bats are indispensable to our ecosystems. This is just a little poster from a bat organization in the States, and I saw this last night and I thought this is really nice. So they have huge numbers of ecosystem services. There was a lovely debate this morning with the Pope and someone, a bat carer a bat scientist or a bat enthusiast, who responded to the Pope. So the Pope was kind of throwing some shade on bats and saying that they were kind of evil. And this person went on a massive tirade to the Pope about how amazing they were, and they pollinate and lots of plants. They're important. They eat lots of insects and save us billions and billions of dollars and pounds in not using pesticide on crops. They are amazing. They've got incredible diversity, and they have adaptations to life which we're just trying to understand at the moment. And they use sophisticated echolocation, which has got lots and lots of adaptations and uses for us as well. So I just want to end on that although bats have changed the world, they've changed the world for mostly good.
Kate, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm still not entirely convinced. You talk about bats as cute. I'm still kind of, well, that last picture is quite cute, but it's absolutely fascinating. I think bats are amazing. You've definitely convinced me of that. There are so many questions, so I'm not going to witter too much. Let's just start with some of the things I think you've touched on, but I think a lot of the questions are things that we haven't necessarily covered. So May Pucky asks, is it most likely that coronavirus was transmitted from bat to human or from bat to animal to human?
Those are things that we just don't know about yet. We know, the only thing that we know for sure is that the coronavirus, which is the one which is causing the COVID-19 disease, is 96% similar to one that was previously found and matched to one in a Chinese bat, the horseshoe bat with a cute nose. So that's the only thing that we know for sure. There are several similarities to the coronaviruses found in pangolins. So it could be that that's also added into the kind of viral cocktail that happened in that spillover event. But we don't really know anything for sure. And it's really important to be clear about what we know and what we suspect. So I think we suspect it's from bats. We don't know. We haven't found that virus, and we know that it's present, something, you know, that similarity to that virus is found in other animals, but we just don't understand how that happened. It could have been that this virus has been circulating in the human population for a while and it's just taken off, or it separated from bats ages ago and then it was in another, say, domestic species or another wild animal. We just don't know that yet, but I'm sure we will find out.
Well, I'm sure there was lots of investigation going on, lots of conspiracy theories swirling around as well, but let's not get into those right now. So actually, now this is very interesting from Naomi Sim, given your own personal experience. How likely is it that bat carers in the UK would catch a virus from a bat? And she says, my mother's convinced I got pneumonia from a bat. And there were apparently quite a lot of questions along this line. So lots of people quite curious.
So the biggest risk that we have in the UK is from rabies. So we don't have rabies proper, that's from the States, but we have something called lyssavirus in our bats. And but most cases of rabies are from domestic animals like pet dogs and other species. So I think you've got to think about the, okay, let me ask you, how many bats have you actually seen today, last week, this year, in your life?
Had one in my bedroom once on holiday. That was quite scary.
I'm just saying that it's very unlikely for you to come into contact with bats. And
but if, like Naomi, you're caring for a bat, then, I mean, you know, should she be worried?
She should be worried about lyssavirus, because that's something that she should know very well about. But other things, no. That's the only thing that we think can spread into humans from our bats.
Right. So in the UK, not much to worry about. But if you're, I don't know, in a bat cave, it's quite a strange thing.
Yeah, I mean,
bat cave, then
I should have been wearing protective equipment. If I had been and not been stupid and 20, I would have been, you know. So that's what I should have been doing. And you know, bat carers across the UK look after and do so much work for bats and look after bats, and they know that they should be protecting protecting themselves, but also protecting bats too. Like, so protecting them from any diseases that we have. And the bat carers I know are so dedicated and looking after these little bats. It's amazing.
Okay, so keep looking after the bats, guys. Don't give up. We need you to look after the bats.
Definitely.
With all the amazing things they do. Right, so what advice would you give? This is from Aida Otalora Ardia. What advice would you give to safely manipulate bats during field work in tropical environments so that we're not the 20-year-old you?
20-year-old me. I think that really depends on what you're doing in the field. You know, I think that you should be wearing protective equipment because animals have pathogens, you know, it's not just bats. So you should be wearing protective equipment if you're handling wild species to protect you and them from that interface. So I think it just depends on what exactly they're doing in the field. If they're extracting viruses and blood from bats and then putting them back in an ethical way, then I think you should be wearing more protective equipment. But if you're doing a bat survey at night with a bat detector, then that's totally fine. I think it's just a proportionate approach to, you know, understanding the risks that wild animals present with zoonotic transfer. I mean, this isn't a new thing. This is what happens, you know. I think the spotlight's on it now, but this has always happened. And for most pathogens transferring into humans, nothing happens. It's a crazy rare event because it's a really difficult thing to do. And it's a really difficult thing to get into a human, and then it's super difficult to go human to human. So there's only been a handful of diseases that have ever pathogens that have ever managed to do that.
But is the fear, I mean, you talk about it as a crazy rare event, but is the fear from some of the other slides that you showed us that actually it could become rather less rare?
Yeah, I guess if you have a 1 in a million event, and then you've got millions of humans interacting with wildlife in a way that's now changing, then yes, there is a danger that we're going to get more of these. And I think it's a real problem that we have to face as an international community about understanding what the risks are when you deforest a landscape. So the short-term gain is you've got a cash crop of soybean or oil palm, but the long-term risks and the long-term sustainability of that system is much lower. What about carbon storage, disease prevention, you know, air quality? We have to think in a much broader way about what the consequences are, and a long-term way of consequences of changing ecosystems in an unsustainable way.
It's fascinating. Julia Wormwood asks, how long do bats live?
That's a really hard question, actually, because the more you look, like, the longer bats live, because you study things for a long, you know, that if you look for how hard you study something, it kind of goes up the more you study it. But we think bats do live quite a long time. And actually this is really sad, but I did my PhD on that.
Right, on how long bats live. Fantastic.
On their life histories and how that evolved. So we think, I think the longest record is is nearly 40 years.
Wow.
And for a tiny, tiny thing, that's really amazing, you know, and they've got some really amazing adaptations and DNA repair mechanisms to do that. And they have really low rates of cancer as well, which is fascinating. And they can
how do you
drop
track the life of a bat? I mean, it's not like birds. You can't sort of ring them, can you? Or how does it work?
You can ring them. You have to be very careful about their forearms and, you know, not catching their wings. So you have to do it under license, but you can put rings on. So I used to work at London Zoo, and the rings that everybody had in the UK were the zoo ones. And you know, the person that was actually running that program in the zoo left many years ago. But when I arrived, everybody gave me these rings because they said, you study bats, so you must want all of these. Okay. Yeah, so you can find rings from these bats, and then some bats migrate like massive distances. So there's a bat which a little pipistrelle bat which can migrate like thousands of kilometers, and so we only found out because someone picked up a ring that was done in the UK, and it was in Latvia.
Wow.
I mean, it was crazy.
That is amazing. That's absolutely fascinating. So this is a question from Holly Wrightson. She says, what's your opinion on the Chinese research, JQE 2011, that appears to suggest that bats haven't lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C? If correct, would this influence or change your ideas about the immune system of the bat?
I've got no idea. What? I don't know. I've got no idea. Sorry. Vitamin
Not
C.
Something you thought about.
No.
Okay. Sorry, Holly. We're not making headway there. Okay, so is there any evidence, this is something you must be worried about, Ginger Biscuit's asking, is there any evidence this will lead to prejudice against bats and affect their survival?
I think that's a real danger, and I've been spending the last 3 weeks trying to convince people that the root cause of spillover from animals is our actions and not a particular species. So happens
bat PR, aren't you? You are doing bat PR,
yeah.
Crisis management for bats.
But you know, it's not, you know, today it's bats, tomorrow it'll be civets, or the next day it'll be badgers, or, you know, it's not about them, it's about us, and it's about our actions and how we're changing landscapes to be more risky. And we really need to think about that in a more joined up way. And we need to have ecologists talk to the public health people. So when they make public health interventions or people are changing landscapes for profit, they've really got to think about what the outcomes are going to be for that.
But presumably, in your experience, I know you've done a lot of bat conservancy work, they're a hard sell, aren't they, bats? And yet, you know, you're passionate about them. They do these amazing things within the ecosystem. But you know, this isn't going to help, is it? It's not.
No, it isn't going to help. But you know, I think the Bat Conservation Trust has been going for over 20 years, and when they started, I think bats were definitely thought of as like a bit evil. They get in your hair. They're just weird. But I think they've really, you know, I used to be the chair, so I've got a vested interest. But I think people think they're cool. They're cool. Like I take kids out on bat walks, and you lie them down on a rug or something in a green space in London or New York or wherever, and the bats will fly over their heads, and you have little bat detectors that can pick up their echolocation calls. It's fascinating. It's like a whole new world of sound that they use that we can't hear. It's just fascinating, and they're fascinating things. They've always fascinated me. They're kind of secret, a bit weird. You know, what's not to like? They've got cute faces.
You're a wonderful ambassador for bats, and that bats need you. They really need you. So how do extreme events, heat in particular, alter bats' physiology in terms of virus shedding? And that's asked by Tasif Ahmed.
That's a really good question. I think we all wish we knew a bit more about that. I think that viruses and bats and viruses have got a really interesting co-evolution going on. But I think that when they're really stressed, like say when they haven't got enough food, or it's heat stress, or it's being caught in a cage in a wet market, I think that their immune system, does start to break down a bit, and they get more stressed and more unable to cope. And I think they can start shedding viruses under those situations, like we would do if we were really stressed. So I think even their kind of amazing physiology can't cope with such extreme events. And I think there's some evidence to show that they do shed more in those situations, like anything would.
So, and forgive me if this is sort of going beyond kind of your area, but when you have a situation like a wet market where there are lots of different species together in cages in an unnatural environment for them, clearly that presumably would increase the likelihood of virus shedding.
Yeah, definitely. If you put an animal under stress, it affects its immune system, and an immune system is under strain. So in that case, it can start shedding pathogens that are in their bodies. So if you've got kind of animals under massive stress, and you've got a number of different animals in the market, then there is a dangerous potential there for viruses to transfer, not only to humans but to other animals as well. So I think that's one of the ideas about where this virus, the coronavirus, has come from, is that it was either in the populations in these bats, or it was in another animal that then got passed to humans. So it wouldn't be surprising if it happened in that wet market, but it could have happened in a farm, for example, up the road, or it could have happened somewhere else. But that's that's our suspicion at the moment, with no evidence.
How confident do you feel, given the politics, that we will find out what happened?
Gosh, I think that's an interesting question. I think my colleagues in the States who work for EcoHealth Alliance have been working in China for decades, right? We've been working with partners in China, and they have very, very good relationships with local virologists and local wildlife disease experts, and they've been working with them for years. And it was one of the experts in China in working with those guys in the States that alerted the world that this was very close to one of the viruses that she'd picked up in a bat in China. So, from a professional standpoint, and I can't speak to the politics, but no, I know that there are some really excellent researchers in China that are trying their best to figure this out. So I don't know what the international politics are or what the Chinese regime might do, but I know that my colleagues have been working with the Chinese scientists for many years and have got very good relationships with them.
Interesting. Besides being seed dispersers and controlling pests or insects, how else are bats beneficial for the ecosystem? That's from Maria Paz Duenas.
So they do, seed dispersal is one thing. So for some species, because they are dispersing large distances, they can reach like remote places which other species can't. So they're really widely distributed, and they can be really, really useful as pioneer species. So they can kind of start reseeding areas that are really hard to get to, like remote islands, for example. So that's really good. They've got they pollinate and are responsible for some of the cash crops that we use, like mangoes and bananas, but also tequila, like agave for tequila, which is very important. So there's a huge amount of seed dispersal and pollination that's going on, and some of those are really close relationships, so that there are some very symbiotic relationships with those species. So if you got rid of those bats, then you wouldn't have any of those plants. But also insect control is really, really important. So that's a really interesting disease angle too. So if you got rid of bats, you might have more mosquitoes and get more malaria. So it's kind of, you need a kind of balanced system for that to happen. You've also got some really interesting work on how they can control cancer, that they can, fix DNA repair, so that like understanding how bats do that, I think is going to be really, really critical for a lot of different areas. Also, bats use really, really sophisticated echolocation, and that's, you know, being used for, you know, medical imaging, but also for navigation, and trying to understand how bats do that and what they do is just absolutely incredible. And also bats have got an amazing way of flying, and people have been starting to copy how they fly and how they do it in such an efficient way in like drones. So some bat drones that have been copied. So I think there's loads of things which we don't really understand that are really important for you know, for scientific research in the future.
Fantastic. So
I might have to put the light on.
Go on, you nip off and put the light on, and we'll oh, look, the lights come on. It's getting lighter.
Okay, that's better.
Wait for Kate to come back.
Maybe this wouldn't happen on Radio 4.
No, it's much easier. Radio. Pictures are better, always. So William Bolton asks, can humans spread C19 to bats or other animals?
That's a really, really, really interesting question. I think we're just trying to understand whether that's true yet. So we don't quite know. Yeah, I would say. I think, yeah, that's a really, I don't know. But I think that's something that's under consideration at the moment.
And something that's, yes, being talked about a lot, I think. And then Sandy Coxill asks, what other animals could transfer such a devastating virus to humans?
Well, there's such a huge range of animals which cause zoonotic diseases. So, you know, there are like HIV/AIDS has caused millions and millions and millions and millions of people to die. And that's from chimpanzees. Yeah. And, you know, so it's really that all species have viruses and have pathogens that can infect us. It's just that some are, you know, more successful than others, or we have more contact with more species than others. So, you know, domestic species account for quite a lot of zoonotic transfers, and antibiotic resistance is another, you know, big global concern, and that's, you know, caused by putting too much antibiotics into domestic intensely farmed agricultural systems. Yeah. So that's another reason to think about how we, you know, manage these species.
Fantastic. So now Lauren Jarvis and James Draven say, we're travel writers specialising in nature and wildlife, and we frequently find ourselves exploring foreign bat caves. Are we unwise to do so? And what about the numerous tours around the world that take tourists to such caves?
Yeah, I think that we've been talking about that in the bat community, actually, about how, you know, there is a possibility of spreading COVID to different bat populations. And also, you do have to be careful when you're in bat caves, because, you know, in some latitudes, bats will be hibernating. And so they store up all of their energy, and then, you know, they're hibernating and going to low metabolisms across the winter to save energy. And if you're in that cave, you're raising the temperature and then frightening them, and then they wake up and use the energy reserves. So you do have to be careful about disturbing bats in their roost. But, you know, if you're going into a roost and it's, you know, it's safe to do so, and it's safe for the bats, then, you know, you should be wearing a mask at least, I think.
Oh, so actually bat tourism, perhaps, I mean, one imagines you sort of in your shorts and your flip-flops, but actually it should perhaps be a little bit more thought through.
Well, I think that's the same for any species, really, any kind of large aggregation of things. You know, there is a chance of getting something from them.
Yeah, interesting, right. So what bat research projects are you doing in the UK? Are there opportunities to volunteer with you and take part in some bat research and conservation work? Ellie Hack, well done. Look, getting in a bit of career opportunity there.
So I'm actually a statistician. So I look at lots of numbers and try to understand trends from those numbers. So we've been, and some of my colleagues on the call have been looking at how population trends are declining or increasing across the country using data from the Bat Conservation Trust. So there's lots of opportunities there to do some coding, some analysis if you want, but we're also working with the Bat Conservation Trust in developing a new survey. So we'll be developing some tiny sensors, some acoustic sensors that we could post to you, and then you put them outside in your garden or wherever, and we will do all the analysis of the calls and then upload your results to you. Ooh. So we're doing a new survey called the British Bat Survey, and I've been helping design all the maths behind how you do that and how you recognise different species sounds from large files of recordings. So that's something that we're hoping to launch next year. And we've been trialling it out over the last few years, so that's something that you could get involved with. But Bat Conservation Trust also has lots of surveys that you can take part in as a citizen, and so you can just kind of go on the website and have a look at what they've been doing. So there's some really cool stuff.
And if anyone is interested, just whilst we're on career advice, if anyone's interested in working in the kind of area that you do, what was your sort of academic background? What pathway did you take?
I was a zoologist, so I did zoology at university, and then I kind of really hated maths and thought I was just terrible at it, really, and coding, that wasn't for girls. So, but that's what exactly I do now. So I kind of come from, I was really interested in animals, and then but in order to save animals you need to understand what's happening to them, and you need to understand how to monitor them, and you need to understand the interactions within different ecological communities and what the consequences are. And there's so much data now, and you know, that's kind of led me to where I am at the moment, where I collect data and we analyze it. So I think having some coding skills and some stats skills will really set you apart from the other ecologists who may have amazing field skills, don't get me wrong, that's brilliant. But if you've got some coding and some stats, that will set you up.
There you go, Ellie, some really good advice there. I don't know where you are in your career path, but great advice there. Okay, I think we've got time for one last one. I'm looking for a clock, we're nearly out of time, but Russell Merritt asks, has there been any evidence of reverse zoonosis, humans passing pathogens to bats or other animals?
Yes, and I'll give you an example from bats, actually. So we think that the white nose fungus, which has impacted huge amounts of bats in the US, is actually from Europe. So the evidence is a little bit mixed at the moment, so not completely for sure, but we think that the pathogen was brought over by people that were caving in Europe or in this region, and then moved over to the States and then infected bat caves and the environments for the US bats, and that's caused mass declines in populations there. So, you know, bats are very good with viruses and things which are intracellular, but they're just as bad as us with pathogens which are extracellular, and funguses are one of those things. And it's caused huge population crashes of bat populations in the US. And it's probably mediated by us spreading that pathogen around the world.
Gosh, Kate, it is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. Oh, I think I can see at the bottom of the screen, I haven't been following them in real time, but lots of comments. I think lots of people have really enjoyed what you had to say. I certainly have. Absolutely fascinating. And I am going to think of bats as cute from now on.
I'm going to send you some cute pictures.
Okay, I look forward to it. Kate Jones, thank you very much. We have another Zoom event this time next week with Professor Guy Standing, who'll be discussing universal basic income, and there's spaces available, so do join us. All you do is head to agilerabbit.com and register and keep up to date with all the new events. Thank you very much to Agile Rabbit for hosting and organising, and do keep a lookout for all their podcasts and all the various events that they do.
Thanks so much to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for questions and things as well. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.